The widow's hands were scrubbing blood from someone else's floor when the cowboy first noticed the cavalry ring hidden beneath her threadbare sleeve. And in that single glimpse of tarnished gold, Owen Parrish understood that the woman everyone called a simple servant was harboring secrets that could either destroy her or set her free. Rock Springs, Wyoming in the summer of 1876, was a town built on coal dust and broken promises, where the railroad brought desperate souls seeking fortune and found only back-breaking labor beneath an unforgiving sun. Owen had drifted into town 3 weeks prior, his saddlebags light and his conscience lighter, looking for honest work to tide him over until the autumn cattle drives began. He had found employment at the general store, hauling freight and managing inventory for old Marcus Bellamy, a man whose generosity extended only as far as his profit margins allowed. The woman worked next door at the boarding house run by Constance Harwick, a bitter widow who treated her staff like property and her tenants only marginally better. Owen had seen the servant girl dozens of times, carrying water buckets that seemed too heavy for her slender frame, beating rugs in the alley until the dust made her cough, scrubbing the front steps on her knees while the sun beat down mercilessly on her covered head. She kept her eyes downcast, her responses to questions limited to quiet affirmatives, and her presence so unobtrusive that most people in Rock Springs barely registered her existence. But Owen had been a scout during the war, and scouts learned to notice details that others missed. The way she held herself despite the menial labor spoke of better days. The care she took with her appearance, even in worn clothing that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible, suggested pride that poverty had not quite extinguished. And that ring, catching the light for just a moment as she reached up to hang laundry, that ring told a story she clearly did not want told. He made it his business to learn her name, which proved harder than expected. Constance Harwick called her girl with venomous emphasis. The other boarders, when they acknowledged her at all, simply snapped their fingers or called out servant as though she were interchangeable with any other domestic worker. It was not until he overheard 2 washerwomen gossiping by the town pump that he learned she was called Nora. That Nora Ellis is too proud for her own good, the older washerwoman declared, scrubbing a shirt against her washboard with unnecessary vigor. Acts like she is better than honest work, but there she is, ain't she, on her hands and knees same as the rest of us. Constance says she showed up last winter, half frozen and begging for any kind of position, her companion replied. Took her in out of Christian charity, she did, though the girl barely earns her keep with how slow she works. Owen doubted the charity part. Constance Harwick attended church every Sunday and quoted scripture while paying starvation wages and working her servants until they dropped. Christian charity looked very different in the Bible his mother had read to him as a child. He began finding excuses to be outside when Nora emerged to perform her duties, a delivery that needed checking, inventory that required his presence in the alley, repairs to the loading dock that gave him a clear view of the boarding house's back entrance. He told himself it was simple curiosity, the same instinct that had kept him alive during his scouting days, but something deeper was stirring beneath his conscious reasoning. She was perhaps 24 or 25, though the hard work and poor conditions made it difficult to determine precisely. Her hair, when visible beneath her bonnet, held hints of auburn that caught fire in the sunlight. Her hands were red and chapped from lye soap and constant immersion in wash water, but her fingers were long and elegant, the hands of someone who had once known softer pursuits. And her eyes, the few times he glimpsed them straight on, were the deep green of river water in summer, holding depths of sorrow that struck him like a physical blow. It was on a Thursday, exactly 1 month after his arrival in Rock Springs, that Owen manufactured a reason to speak with her directly. He had noticed Constance Harwick leaving in her buggy, dressed in her best black silk, and clearly headed somewhere that would occupy her for several hours. Nora was alone in the side yard, struggling with a rope line that had come loose from its post, wet sheets threatening to drag in the dirt. "Looks like you could use a hand with that," Owen called out, already moving to help before she could refuse. She startled badly, nearly dropping the entire load, and he caught the pole before it could topple. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in fine lines around her eyes, the pallor beneath what should have been healthy color, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of inadequate food and excessive labor. "I can manage, sir," she said quietly, her voice holding the cultured tones of education despite her evident attempt to sound common. "But I thank you for your kindness." "No need to call me sir," Owen replied, securing the line properly and helping her re-hang the sheets that had slipped. "Name is Owen Parrish. I work next door at Bellamy's store. I know who you are." The words came out quickly, then she seemed to regret them, color rising in her pale cheeks. "I mean, I have seen you about town, of course. Rock Springs is not so large that folks go unnoticed." "Then you have the advantage of me, miss, because while I have seen you working yourself near to death for that Harridan Harwick, I only learned your name by eavesdropping on gossips." He offered a slight smile, hoping to ease the tension visible in every line of her body. "Nora Ellis, unless I was misinformed." Something flickered in her eyes then, an emotion too quick to name but heavy with significance. "Yes, that is correct. Nora Ellis." The pause before she said the surname was barely perceptible, but Owen's trained ear caught it. Ellis was not her true name, or at least not the name she had worn longest. The discovery should have made him wary, should have sent him backing away from whatever trouble she was clearly hiding from. But instead, it only deepened his curiosity and his unexpected concern for her welfare. "Well, Miss Ellis, I hope you will not think me forward, but you look like you have not had a proper meal in some time. I was about to take my dinner break, and Mrs. Chen at the restaurant always gives me more than I can finish. Would you join me? Just as neighbors, nothing improper about it." She glanced toward the boarding house, calculation and longing warring in her expression. "Mrs. Harwick expects me to complete the laundry before she returns, and there is still the afternoon cleaning and supper preparations, and Mrs. Harwick expects you to work yourself into an early grave for pennies and cruelty," Owen interrupted gently. 20 minutes to eat a meal is not going to make a difference to the laundry, but it might make a considerable difference to whether you have the strength to finish the day. For a long moment, Nora simply stared at him as though kindness was a language she had forgotten how to interpret. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, 20 minutes. But I must eat quickly, Mrs. Chen's restaurant was a small establishment that catered primarily to the Chinese railroad workers, but she welcomed all customers with equal warmth and served food that put the boarding house's grim fare to shame. Owen guided Nora to a corner table where they would be less visible to passing gossips, and ordered 2 plates of beef and vegetables over rice, along with tea and fresh bread. When the food arrived, Nora's careful composure cracked slightly. She ate with the desperate precision of someone who had known genuine hunger, but she did not lose her manners, did not shovel food like an animal. Instead, she maintained the practiced elegance of formal dining even while consuming every morsel on her plate with undisguised need. "When did you last have a full meal?" Owen asked, his own appetite diminishing as he watched her. She finished chewing and swallowed before answering, that ingrained courtesy evident in every gesture. "Mrs. Harwick provides meals as part of my wages." "That was not what I asked." Nora set down her fork carefully, her hands folding in her lap in a gesture that was pure refinement despite her servant's dress. "You are very kind to concern yourself with a stranger's welfare, Mr. Parrish, but I assure you I am managing adequately." "You are starving," he said bluntly. "You are being worked past endurance for wages that barely keep you in shoes. And you are hiding from something or someone, because I have seen hunted creatures before, Miss Ellis, and I know the look." Her face went absolutely white, and for a terrible moment, Owen thought she might faint. Instead, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I must return to my duties. Thank you for the meal." She was gone before he could apologize, moving with surprising speed despite her weakened state. Owen sat alone at the table, cursing his clumsy tongue and his habit of speaking truths that others preferred to avoid. Mrs. Chen appeared with more tea and a look of maternal disapproval. "You scare off your lady friend with big mouth," she observed, refilling his cup. "Young men never learn. Some questions need time before asking." I did not mean to frighten her. Frightened girl does not eat whole plate of food. She eat like starving person who trust you not to take food away. Mrs. Chen's weathered face creased with concern. "That Mrs. Harwick is bad woman. Treats workers like animals. Someone should report to authorities." "What authorities?" Owen asked bitterly. "Sheriff Mulligan could not find justice with a map and a guide, and the territorial governor is too busy lining his pockets to care about one servant girl being mistreated." "Then good men must do what authorities will not." Mrs. Chen patted his shoulder with surprising strength. "You are good man, I think. Good men find ways to help." Over the following week, Owen made himself a nuisance around the boarding house, though he tried to be subtle about it. He repaired a loose board on the front steps without being asked. He helped carry heavy packages that were delivered to Constance Harwick's door. He tipped his hat to Nora whenever their paths crossed and spoke pleasantries that required only simple responses, never pushing for more than she seemed willing to give. Gradually, by imperceptible degrees, she stopped flinching when she saw him. Her responses grew from single words to brief sentences. And one afternoon, when he found her struggling to move a trunk that some inconsiderate boarder had left blocking the cellar door, she actually gave him a small smile when he helped shift it. "You seem to be everywhere I need assistance," she observed, that careful control slipping enough to show hints of dry humor beneath. "Just lucky timing," Owen replied, though they both knew it was far more deliberate than that. "Or maybe Rock Springs is even smaller than we thought. Perhaps." She brushed dust from her skirts, and once again he caught a glimpse of that ring on her finger, quickly hidden as she noticed his gaze. "Mr. Parrish, I must apologize for my abrupt departure at the restaurant. You were nothing but kind, and I repaid you with rudeness." "No apology needed. I was too forward with my questions." He hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. "But my concern was genuine, Miss Ellis. Whatever circumstances brought you here, whatever you are running from or hiding from, you do not deserve to be treated the way Harwick treats you." Nora glanced around nervously, ensuring they were alone in the alley. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There are worse situations than difficult employers, Mr. Parrish. At least here I have a roof over my head and work to occupy my hands. A woman alone in this world cannot afford to be particular about her circumstances." "A woman alone," Owen repeated carefully. "But you are not alone by choice, are you?" Her green eyes met his directly for the first time, and the weight of grief in them nearly staggered him. "None of us choose our losses, Mr. Parrish. We only choose how we survive them." Before he could respond, Constance Harwick's voice cut through the afternoon air like a rusty blade. "Girl, where is my afternoon tea? You expect me to die of thirst while you waste time gossiping in alleyways." Nora's entire demeanor shifted instantly, that brief moment of openness vanishing behind walls of servile compliance. "Coming immediately, Mrs. Harwick," she called back, then hurried toward the boarding house without another glance at Owen. He stood in the alley long after she disappeared, her words echoing in his mind. None of us choose our losses. What had she lost? Who had she lost? And why was she hiding in Rock Springs, working herself to death under an assumed name? The answer came 3 days later in the most unexpected way imaginable. Owen had been asked to deliver a shipment of supplies to Fort Bridger, a cavalry post about 30 miles west of Rock Springs. The job would take 2 days, there and back, and offered enough extra pay to make it worthwhile. He accepted readily, always happy to vary his routine and earn additional money toward his eventual ranch. Fort Bridger was a sprawling complex of wooden buildings and corrals, bustling with activity despite the summer heat. Owen completed his delivery to the quartermaster, a grizzled sergeant named Morrison who checked each item against his inventory list with painstaking care. "Everything seems to be in order," Morrison finally declared, signing the receipt with a flourish. "Bellamy usually sends quality goods. I will give him that. Not like some suppliers who try to pass off spoiled flour and worn-out rope. Marcus Bellamy is honest enough when it comes to his business, even if he is tight with $1 toward his workers," Owen agreed, accepting the signed paperwork. "You fellows keeping busy out here." "Always something needs doing at a cavalry post," Morrison replied, settling back in his chair with evident relief at being off his feet. "Though we are understaffed since the Little Bighorn. Lost a lot of good men in that disaster, and the replacements they are sending are mostly green recruits who do not know which end of a horse to feed." Owen had heard about the battle, of course. Everyone in the territories had heard about Custer's catastrophic defeat just 1 month prior, in June of 1876. The newspapers were still full of outraged editorials and calls for vengeance against the Sioux and Cheyenne. "Did you lose anyone from this post?" he asked, making conversation while Morrison organized the supply receipts. "Captain Richard Edward," Morrison said heavily. "Fine officer, one of the best I served under in 20 years of military life. He was on temporary assignment to the 7th Cavalry, got caught up in the whole mess at Little Bighorn. Body was never recovered for proper burial." Something in the name struck Owen like a bell, though he could not immediately place why. "Edward, was he stationed here long?" "About 4 years. Came west after the war, worked his way up from lieutenant. Married too, which made his death even more tragic. His widow was supposed to receive his pension and benefits, but there was some kind of problem with the paperwork." Morrison shook his head in disgust. Army bureaucracy at its finest. Woman loses her husband, and they quibble over documentation like petty lawyers. Owen's pulse had begun to race, pieces of a puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. What happened to the widow? Is she still around the area? No idea. She left the fort shortly after receiving news of the captain's death. Some of the other officers' wives said she took it real hard, barely spoke to anyone after the memorial service. Can't say I blame her. It is one thing to lose your husband in battle, another thing entirely to be denied the support the government promised in return for his service. "Do you remember her name?" Morrison frowned, thinking. "Something common. Mary? No, that was Lieutenant Bradshaw's wife. Margaret? No." He snapped his fingers. "Nora, that was it. Nora Edward. Pretty young thing, always very polite and proper. The captain was devoted to her, everyone could see it." Owen felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath his feet. Nora Edward, not Nora Ellis. The ring he had glimpsed was not just any jewelry. It was her wedding band, the ring that marked her as the widow of a cavalry captain who had died at the Little Bighorn. And she was in Rock Springs, hiding under a false name, working as a servant because the Army had denied her the pension she was legally entitled to receive. This pension situation, Owen said carefully, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the anger building in his chest. What exactly was the problem? Why would they deny benefits to a legal widow? Morrison shrugged uncomfortably. I only heard rumors, you understand, but supposedly there was some question about the marriage documentation. The captain and his wife were married back east somewhere, and when the Army requested verification, something did not match up in their records. Without proper proof of marriage, they could not authorize pension payments. Seemed like nonsense to me. I saw them together plenty of times and they were clearly devoted to each other. But the Army does not care about what enlisted men see. They care about paperwork and regulations. That is barbaric, Owen said, not bothering to hide his disgust. The woman's husband dies serving his country, and they leave her destitute over missing paperwork. Welcome to military justice, Morrison replied cynically. I have seen worse over the years, though this one stuck in my craw more than most. Captain Edward was a good man, and his wife deserved better. Owen left Fort Bridger with his mind churning. Everything made terrible, perfect sense now. Nora had been left alone after her husband's death, denied the financial support she had every right to expect. Without family or resources, she had fled to a place where no one knew her, hiding her identity to avoid questions she could not safely answer. Perhaps creditors had been pursuing her for debts incurred during her marriage. Perhaps she feared the Army might accuse her of fraud if they discovered she was claiming to be Captain Edward's widow without approved documentation. Whatever her reasons, she had chosen to disappear into the hardest, most anonymous work available, sacrificing her health and dignity to survive. The injustice of it burned in his gut like bad whiskey. This was not right. This was not how a grateful nation was supposed to treat the widows of fallen soldiers, and if the proper authorities would not address the wrong, then Owen would find a way to do it himself. But first, he needed Nora to trust him with the truth. And that, he suspected, would prove far more difficult than any bureaucratic battle with the Army. When Owen returned to Rock Springs the following afternoon, he found the town in unusual turmoil. A crowd had gathered outside the boarding house, and angry voices carried on the still air. He pushed through the onlookers to discover Constance Harwick standing on her front porch, her face mottled with rage, while Nora stood below her on the steps, soaking wet and visibly shaking. Clumsy, worthless creature, Constance was shrieking. That was my best tea service brought all the way from Boston. Do you have any idea what it cost? It was an accident, Mrs. Harwick, Nora said, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. The tray was too heavy, and my hands were still wet from the washing. I will repay you for the damage from my wages. Your wages? Constance laughed harshly. You earn $3 a month, girl. That tea service was worth $50 at least. You will be working for me until you are an old woman to pay off that debt. Owen felt something snap inside him, that final thread of restraint that had kept him from interfering directly in Nora's situation. He mounted the steps in 3 long strides, placing himself between Nora and her employer. That is enough, Mrs. Harwick, he said quietly, but with an edge that made several people in the crowd shift nervously. You will not speak to her that way. Constance's face went purple. How dare you? This is my property, my employee, and none of your concern. I am making it my concern. Owen turned to Nora, gentling his voice considerably. Miss Ellis, or should I say Mrs. Edward, I would be honored if you would allow me to escort you away from this place. You do not have to stay here another moment." Nora's eyes went wide with shock and fear. "How do you cannot." "I do not know what you mean. I was at Fort Bridger yesterday. I spoke with Sergeant Morrison. He told me about Captain Richard Edward and his widow, Nora, who left the fort after being denied her rightful pension." Owen held out his hand to her. "I know who you are, and I know what was done to you. It was not fair, it was not right, and you do not have to hide any more." The crowd had gone silent, everyone straining to hear this unexpected drama. Constance Harwick's expression had transformed from rage to calculation, her sharp mind immediately seizing on potential advantage. "So the girl is a liar as well as clumsy," she declared triumphantly. "Working under false pretenses, she was. I could have her arrested for fraud." "You could try," Owen agreed coldly. "And while you were doing that, I could share with the sheriff some observations about your business practices. How you pay your workers less than the territorial minimum wage. How you serve meals to your boarders that even a dog would refuse. How you keep 3 sets of account books, one for yourself, one for your investors, and one for the tax assessors. I have been watching you, Mrs. Harwick, and I have been taking notes." It was a bluff, mostly, though Owen had indeed observed enough questionable practices to make trouble for the boarding house owner if he chose. The threat had its desired effect. Constance's face drained of color, then flushed again with impotent rage. "Get off my property," she hissed. "Both of you. And do not think you will receive any wages owed, girl. Consider them forfeit for the tea service and your deception." "Keep the damned wages," Owen shot back. "It would take a chemist to find actual money in what you pay anyway." He turned to Nora, his expression softening. "Please. Let me help you. You do not belong here." For a long moment, Nora stood frozen, clearly torn between fear, pride, and desperate hope. Then, with a visible effort, she straightened her spine and placed her wet, reddened hand in Owen's calloused palm. "Very well, Mr. Parrish. I accept your kind offer." The crowd parted before them as Owen led Nora away from the boarding house, her few possessions left behind in the tiny room she had occupied. He could feel her trembling as they walked, shock and relief and terror all warring within her slender frame. When they reached the general store, he guided her to the back room where Marcus Bellamy kept a small office and living space. "Wait here," Owen instructed gently, settling her into the most comfortable chair available. "I need to speak with Mr. Bellamy about some arrangements." He found his employer in the front of the store, already having heard about the commotion from customers who could speak of nothing else. Marcus Bellamy was a practical man who cared more about profit than gossip, which made him easier to negotiate with than most. "I need a favor," Owen said without preamble. "Or rather, I need to call in wages owed early. I want to rent the room above the storage shed out back, the one you have been using for excess inventory." Bellamy raised an eyebrow. "That room is not fit for habitation. It is full of crates and has not been cleaned in years. I will clean it and move the crates. I just need you to say yes and deduct reasonable rent from my pay." Owen met his employer's gaze steadily. "The lady needs a safe place to stay, and she needs it now." "This is not negotiable for me, Mr. Bellamy. If you say no, I will find other employment and other arrangements, but either way I am helping her." The older man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You always struck me as the quixotic type, Parrish. Too much honor for your own good. Fine. 25 cents a week for the room and you handle all the cleaning and maintenance. But if there is trouble, legal or otherwise, I wash my hands of it." "There will not be trouble," Owen promised. "Just a woman trying to survive after the government failed her." It took him the rest of the afternoon, and most of the evening to make the room habitable. He moved crates, swept years of accumulated dust, scrubbed the single window until light could actually penetrate, and borrowed basic furnishings from various sources. A bed frame from Mrs. Chen, who had extras from her late husband's boarding days. A washstand from the church charity collection. A small table and chair that the blacksmith had been meaning to throw away. Blankets, a pillow, a lamp, dishes, and basic supplies purchased from the store using money Owen had been saving for his eventual ranch. By the time he finished, full dark had fallen and his body ached from exertion, but the room looked almost cozy. Certainly it was better than the drafty closet Nora had occupied at Constance Harwick's establishment. He found her still sitting in Bellamy's office, exactly where he had left her hours before. She had not moved, as though paralyzed by shock or uncertainty. Her servant's dress had dried, but it still showed the water stains from whatever accident had triggered the final confrontation with Constance. "Come with me," Owen said gently. "I have something to show you." He led her through the darkening yard to the storage shed, up the narrow exterior stairs to the room above. When he opened the door and showed her the modest but clean space, Nora made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Mr. Parrish, I cannot. This is too much. I have no means to repay such generosity." "I am not asking for repayment." Owen lit the lamp, casting warm light over the simple furnishings. "I am offering you a safe place to stay while we figure out how to get you what you are actually owed. That pension money, the captain's benefits, all of it. We are going to fight the Army's decision, and we are going to win." Nora sank onto the edge of the bed, her composure finally cracking. Tears spilled down her cheeks, though she made no sound, as if even crying was something she had learned to do silently to avoid disturbing others. "You do not understand what you are offering," she whispered. "The Army is massive, the bureaucracy impenetrable. I tried, Mr. Parrish. After Richard died, I spent weeks going from office to office, writing letters, pleading with anyone who would listen. They would not even see me, most of them. And the ones who did made it clear that, without the proper documentation, I had no case. Our marriage certificate was lost in a fire back in Pennsylvania before Richard shipped west. We kept meaning to obtain a replacement copy, but there was always something more pressing, and we thought we had time." Her voice broke. "We thought we had so much time." Owen crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "Then we will start by getting that replacement documentation. There must be records in Pennsylvania, copies maintained by the county or the church where you were married. It might take time, it might cost money, but if the paperwork exists, we can find it. And if it does not exist? If the fire destroyed everything?" Nora's green eyes were full of anguish and fading hope. "What then, Mr. Parrish? Will you have wasted all this effort and money on a lost cause? Then we will find another way," Owen said firmly. "Witnesses who attended your wedding. Fellow officers who knew you and the captain as husband and wife. Anything that establishes the legitimacy of your marriage. The law cannot simply ignore reality because of a clerical error. You are Captain Edward's widow. You are entitled to his pension, and I am going to make sure you get it, even if I have to ride to Washington and demand answers from the Secretary of War himself." A startled laugh escaped her, genuine if slightly hysterical. "You are either the bravest man I have ever met or the most foolish." "Probably both," Owen admitted with a slight smile. "I have been accused of worse. Now, have you eaten today?" Mrs. Harwick threw the lunch she provided onto the ground after I broke the tea service. She said I did not deserve food if I could not perform simple tasks without destroying her property. Owen stood abruptly, fury rising again at the casual cruelty of it. Stay here. I will bring you dinner. And tomorrow we will start making plans. But tonight you rest and eat and remember that you are safe now." He returned 20 minutes later with enough food from Mrs. Chen's restaurant to feed 3 people, and the satisfaction of knowing that Mrs. Chen had refused payment when she learned who the meal was for. "That poor girl," Mrs. Chen had said, packing containers with fragrant rice, vegetables, dumplings, and sliced pork. "Everyone in town is talking about what you did, standing up to Mrs. Harwick like that. Some say you are troublemaker, but I say you are decent man. We need more decent men in this world." Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Owen would work his regular shifts at the general store while Nora slowly recovered her strength in the room above the storage shed. He brought her meals 3 times a day, initially from Mrs. Chen's restaurant, then from the boarding house across town run by a kindly widow named Mrs. Patterson, who had heard about Nora's situation and offered to provide food at a reduced rate. Gradually, Nora began to venture out during quiet hours, walking through town with her head covered, clearly nervous about being recognized or confronted. Owen accompanied her when his work allowed, both for protection and for the simple pleasure of her company. As her physical health improved with regular meals and adequate rest, the full depth of her intelligence and character became apparent. Nora Edward was educated far beyond the typical frontier woman, speaking knowledgeably about literature, history, and politics when she forgot to guard her words. She had been raised in Philadelphia, the daughter of a textile merchant who had lost his fortune to bad investments and died when she was 18. Left with nothing, she had become a teacher at a girls' school, where she met Richard Edward during his brief furlough between postings. "He was everything I never knew I wanted," Nora told Owen one evening as they sat on the steps outside her room, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Honorable, kind, brave without being foolish about it. He made me laugh, which I had not done much of in the years after my father's death. When he proposed, I did not hesitate. I knew military life would be hard, that we would be separated often, that I would have to live in rough conditions far from everything I had known. None of it mattered because I would be with him." "How long were you married?" Owen asked quietly. 5 years. We wed in 1871, just before he was ordered west. I followed him 6 months later after he secured proper housing at Fort Bridger." She smiled at the memories, though tears glittered in her eyes. They were good years, mostly. Hard sometimes, lonely when he was away on patrol, but good. He was making a career in the cavalry, working his way up through merit. We talked about buying land someday, starting a ranch when he retired. We wanted children, but I never conceived. Richard said it was probably for the best, given how uncertain our situation was, but I knew he was disappointed. "And then came Little Bighorn." "And then came Little Bighorn," Nora repeated softly. "He was assigned to temporary duty with the 7th Cavalry in late May. I knew something was planned, something big, but he could not share details. The last time I saw him, he kissed me goodbye and told me to have faith, that he would return in a few weeks and we would have a proper anniversary celebration." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "That was the 23rd of May, 1876. He died on the 25th of June. I learned about it 3 days later when the telegraph arrived at the fort. And just like that, everything I had built with him was gone." Owen wanted to reach for her hand to offer physical comfort, but he sensed she needed space for this telling. "When did the Army start giving you trouble about the pension?" "Almost immediately. The officer handling Richard's affairs asked for our marriage certificate so they could process the widow's benefits. When I told him it had been destroyed in a fire, he said I would need to obtain a replacement copy from the county, where we were married. I wrote to the courthouse in Pennsylvania, explaining the situation and requesting documentation. They wrote back saying their records showed no marriage between Nora Eliza Emmett and Richard John Edward on the date I specified. Could they have been looking at the wrong date or wrong spellings? I thought of that. I wrote again, providing variations on the date and multiple possible spellings. They searched their records thoroughly and found nothing. The fire that destroyed our personal copy apparently destroyed the county's records as well. The courthouse burned in 1872, and while most documents were saved, some were lost. Our marriage certificate was among them. What about the church where you were married? A small chapel in Philadelphia. It burned down in 1874. Different fire, same result. The minister who performed the ceremony had retired and moved to Ohio. I wrote to him but never received a response. I suspect the letter never found him. Nora's voice was flat now, reciting facts that still had power to wound. Without documentation, the Army refused to process my claim. They said they could not verify the marriage had actually occurred, and without verification, they could not authorize pension payments. I tried explaining that everyone at Fort Bridger knew Richard and I were married, that we had lived as husband and wife for 5 years. They said personal testimony was insufficient without legal documentation. So they left you with nothing. Not quite nothing. Richard had personal effects, his horse, some savings, but the savings were barely enough to cover his debts and settle our affairs. I sold what I could, but it was not enough to live on for more than a few months. And I discovered that being a military widow without official recognition is a very lonely position. People were sympathetic, but they could not help. Eventually, I realized I needed to leave, to go somewhere I could start fresh. She gestured around them at the darkness of Rock Springs. So I came here, changed my name to something close enough that I would respond naturally, and found work that would keep me alive if not comfortable. Why Ellis instead of keeping Edward? Because creditors were looking for Nora Edward. Because I was afraid the Army might decide I was trying to defraud them if I continued claiming to be Richard's widow without proof. Because it hurt too much to be called Mrs. Edward when I no longer had any legal standing to that name. Her voice broke slightly. I was his wife, Mr. Parrish. I loved him with everything I had. And the government we served, that he died for, decided that love and loyalty and 5 years of marriage meant nothing without the right paperwork. Owen could not stop himself then. He reached over and took her hand, half expecting her to pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, holding tight as though he were an anchor in stormy seas. "We are going to fix this," he promised. "I do not know exactly how yet, but we will find a way. You were married to Captain Edward. Everyone who knew you both understood that, and the Army is going to acknowledge it whether they want to or not." Nora looked at him in the starlight, this cowboy who had inserted himself into her life without invitation and refused to abandon her despite having every practical reason to do so. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Parrish? You barely know me. You owe me nothing. Yet you have spent your savings to give me housing. You fight battles that are not yours to fight. You make promises that might be impossible to keep. Why?" It was a fair question, one Owen had been asking himself in the quiet hours of the night. The practical answer was that he had a strong sense of justice and could not stand seeing wrongs go uncorrected. The simple answer was that he was a decent man who helped people in need. But there was a third answer, more complicated and more true, that he had been avoiding acknowledging even to himself. "Because from the moment I saw you trying to hang laundry with bleeding hands and broken spirit, I could not look away," he said quietly. "Because your strength in the face of loss and cruelty is humbling. Because when you smile, which is not nearly often enough, it feels like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Because I think you are remarkable, Mrs. Edward, and the world is a poorer place every moment you are suffering unjustly. Nora drew in a sharp breath. Mr. Parrish, Owen, please, I think we are past the point of formality. Owen, then. She said his name carefully, as though testing its shape. You must understand I am still mourning my husband. I loved Richard deeply, and his loss is still raw despite the months that have passed. I am not ready for whatever this might become. I know, Owen replied, and he meant it. I am not asking for anything you cannot freely give. I am not expecting romance or promises. I just want to help you get justice, and maybe, along the way, remind you that not everyone in this world is cruel or selfish or willing to abandon people when they become inconvenient. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, hands still clasped, both lost in their own thoughts as night settled fully over Rock Springs. The next morning, Owen began his campaign in earnest. He visited the telegraph office and sent inquiries to the county courthouse in Pennsylvania, where Nora and Richard had been married, requesting any surviving records related to their union. He wrote to the War Department in Washington, formally challenging their denial of pension benefits and requesting a review of Nora's case. He composed a letter to Fort Bridger, asking Sergeant Morrison and other soldiers who had known the Edwards personally to provide written testimony of the marriage. The responses, when they came over the following weeks, were mixed. The courthouse in Pennsylvania confirmed that their records from 1871 had been lost in a fire, and no copies had been maintained elsewhere. The War Department sent a form letter stating that all decisions were final and could only be reconsidered with presentation of new documentation. But Fort Bridger proved more helpful. Morrison responded personally, along with 3 other sergeants and 2 officers who had known the Edwards. All testified in writing that they had known Captain Richard Edward and his wife Nora as a married couple, that they had lived together as husband and wife, and that everyone at the fort had understood them to be legally wed. It is something, Owen told Nora when the letters arrived. Not enough on its own, but something. We need more, though. The Army will say these men were simply mistaken, or that you and the captain were living together without benefit of marriage. They would never say such things about Richard, Nora protested, color rising in her cheeks. He was an honorable officer who followed regulations to the letter. I know that, and you know that, but bureaucrats in Washington do not care about honor when money is at stake. We need unimpeachable proof. Owen paced her small room, thinking hard. The minister who performed the ceremony. You said you wrote to him in Ohio but never received a response. Yes, Reverend Thomas Whitfield. He would be in his 70s now, assuming he is still alive. What town in Ohio? I am not certain. The letter was sent to general delivery in Columbus, because that was the last address anyone had for him. Then I will go to Columbus and find him myself, Owen declared. If he is alive, if he remembers performing your wedding, his testimony as the officiant would carry significant weight. Nora stared at him in disbelief. Columbus, Ohio is nearly 1,500 miles from here. The journey would take weeks and cost money you do not have. Owen, you cannot be serious. I am completely serious. My employer might grumble, but he will hold my position if I explain the situation. And I have enough saved to cover basic travel expenses if I am careful. He knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. Nora, I am not going to give up on this just because it is difficult or expensive. You deserve justice, and I am going to help you get it no matter what it takes. Something shifted in her expression then, a wall crumbling that she had maintained since her husband's death. No one has fought for me like this since Richard died. No one has even tried." "Then everyone else is a fool," Owen said firmly. "And I count myself fortunate to be smarter than they are, because it means I get to know you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Then Nora leaned forward and kissed his cheek, brief and chaste but full of gratitude and something deeper that made Owen's heart stutter. "Thank you," she whispered. "Whatever happens, thank you for believing me." Owen left for Ohio 3 days later, his saddlebags packed with supplies for the long journey, and a small valise containing all the information they had gathered about Nora's marriage. Marcus Bellamy had been surprisingly understanding about the extended absence, perhaps recognizing that Owen would leave for good if denied permission. "You have always been a reliable worker," Bellamy said, as Owen prepared to depart. "And I respect a man who stands by his convictions. Go find your minister, get your proof, and come back before winter sets in. The store will still be here." The journey east was long and grueling, made mostly by train with connections through multiple cities. Owen used the travel time to rehearse what he would say to Reverend Whitfield if he found the man alive and willing to help. He also spent considerable time thinking about Nora, about the way her hand felt in his, the sound of her rare laughter, the strength she showed even in her darkest moments. He was falling in love with her, had been falling probably since that first meal at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, when he saw her eat like someone who had forgotten what fullness felt like. It was not the sudden, desperate passion of youth, but something deeper and more deliberate. He loved her courage, her dignity, her fierce intelligence. He loved the way she defended her dead husband's honor, even while acknowledging her own pain. He loved the quiet way she was learning to trust again after being betrayed by systems that should have protected her. But Nora was still mourning, still bound to the memory of the man she had lost. Owen understood that, respected it even. If all he ever received from her was friendship and the satisfaction of helping her achieve justice, he would count himself blessed. Though he hoped, in the secret chambers of his heart, that someday she might be ready to risk loving again. Columbus, Ohio was a bustling city compared to Rock Springs, all brick buildings and paved streets and crowds that made Owen nervous after months in wide open spaces. He began his search at churches, explaining his mission to ministers and secretaries, showing them the information he carried about Reverend Thomas Whitfield. The breakthrough came on his 4th day in Columbus, when a young pastor at a Methodist church recognized the name. "Reverend Whitfield. Of course I know him. He attends services here occasionally, though his health keeps him home most days. He lives with his daughter about 3 miles from here. I can give you the address." Owen could have shouted with relief. Instead, he thanked the pastor profusely and made his way to the address provided. A modest house in a quiet neighborhood where trees lined the streets and children played in yards. The woman who answered his knock was perhaps 50, with graying hair and a kind face that showed traces of weariness. "Can I help you?" "I hope so, madam. My name is Owen Parrish, and I have traveled from Wyoming territory to speak with Reverend Thomas Whitfield. I understand he lives here." Her expression grew wary. "My father is very elderly and not in the best health. What is this regarding?" Owen quickly explained the situation, Nora's loss of her husband, the destroyed marriage certificate, the Army's refusal to grant her pension. The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret Sullivan, listened with growing sympathy. "That poor woman," she said when Owen finished. "What a terrible situation. Please come in. My father's memory is not always reliable anymore, but if he can help, I know he would want to." Reverend Whitfield was a frail wisp of a man, sitting in a chair by a sunny window with a blanket over his lap despite the summer heat. But his eyes were sharp and curious when his daughter introduced Owen and explained the reason for the visit. Nora Emmett and Richard Edward, the old man repeated slowly, his voice thin but clear. 1871, you said? Yes, sir. June 14th, 1871 in Philadelphia. A small ceremony at a chapel that no longer exists. Whitfield closed his eyes, and for a moment Owen feared he had fallen asleep or that his memory truly was too compromised to help. Then the old minister smiled. I remember them. The young couple who were so obviously in love they could barely stand still during the ceremony. She was a teacher, he was a soldier heading west. They were both orphans, no family present at the wedding, just a few friends from the school where she taught. I counseled them about the challenges of military marriage, and they assured me they understood. He opened his eyes, fixing Owen with a penetrating gaze. She had green eyes, did she not, and hair that looked like autumn leaves in sunlight. Yes, Owen breathed, hardly daring to believe their luck. Yes, that is Nora exactly. I married them properly and legally, Whitfield declared. I recorded it in my personal registry as I always did. When I retired and moved here, I brought my records with me. Margaret, dear, would you fetch the volumes from 1871? His daughter disappeared into another room and returned carrying several leather-bound books. Together, they paged through careful handwritten entries until Whitfield pointed at a line with a gnarled finger. There. June 14th, 1871. Nora Eliza Emmett and Richard John Edward, married at the Bethel Chapel in Philadelphia. Witnessed by Sarah Thornton and James Mitchell, both teachers. I signed it myself. Owen felt tears prick his eyes as he read the entry, proof that Nora's marriage had been real, documented, and legal. Reverend Whitfield, would you be willing to provide written testimony about this? To sign a statement affirming that you performed the ceremony and that this record is accurate? Of course, the old man said simply. If that poor girl is being denied what her husband earned with his life, then the least I can do is tell the truth. Margaret, fetch paper and pen. I may be old, but my signature is still valid. They spent the next hour drafting a detailed affidavit, which Reverend Whitfield signed and had notarized by a local lawyer Margaret summoned. Owen also carefully copied the relevant entry from the wedding registry, which Whitfield insisted would carry legal weight as a contemporaneous record. You are a good man to help her like this, Whitfield said as Owen prepared to leave. That kind of loyalty and care is rare. I hope she knows how fortunate she is. I am the fortunate one, Owen replied honestly. She is extraordinary, and I am just trying to make sure the world treats her as she deserves. The journey back to Rock Springs felt twice as fast despite being the same distance, buoyed by success and eagerness to share the news with Nora. Owen arrived travel-stained and exhausted on a warm afternoon in late September, having been gone nearly 6 weeks total. He found Nora in her room, sewing by the window light. She looked up when he knocked, and the joy that flooded her face when she recognized him took his breath away. Owen. You are back. I was so worried the journey was so long I feared something had happened. He swept into the room and caught her up in an embrace, propriety forgotten in the moment of reunion. She did not pull away, instead clinging to him like a lifeline. I found him, Owen said against her hair. I found Reverend Whitfield, and he remembers performing your wedding, and he has documentation in his personal records. We have proof, Nora. Real, legal, notarized proof that you and Richard were married. She pulled back to stare at him, tears streaming down her face. Truly. You are not saying this to spare my feelings. In answer, he pulled out the carefully folded documents and showed her everything. The affidavit from Reverend Whitfield, the copied registry entry, the notarization making it all legally binding. Nora read through each page with trembling hands, then pressed the papers to her chest like they were made of gold. "I cannot believe you did this, that you traveled so far, spent so much time and money, all for me." "For you," Owen agreed. "And for justice, and because it was the right thing to do, but mostly for you." They stood facing each other in the small room, the air thick with unspoken feelings. Then Nora stepped forward and kissed him, properly this time, not the chaste brush of gratitude from before, but something deeper and more complex. Owen responded carefully, mindful of her grief and vulnerability, pouring everything he felt into the gentle pressure of his lips against hers. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Nora rested her forehead against his chest. "I am still mourning Richard," she whispered. "Part of me will always love him, always miss what we had." "I know," Owen replied softly. "I would not expect otherwise. Love is not a finite resource, Nora. You can honor his memory while still allowing yourself to move forward." "Is that what this is? Moving forward?" "I hope so. If you are willing, if you think you could someday care for a stubborn cowboy with more determination than common sense." She laughed, the sound muffled against his shirt. "I think I already do care for him, more than is probably wise, given how recently my world fell apart." "The heart does not follow convenient timelines," Owen said, tipping her chin up so he could see her face. "We can take this as slowly as you need. There is no rush, no expectation. I just want to be near you, to keep helping you, to see where this path might lead." "Then stay," Nora said simply. "Stay, and we will figure out the rest together." The next phase of their battle began immediately. Owen and Nora composed a detailed letter to the War Department, including all the documentation they had gathered. The testimonies from Fort Bridger, Reverend Whitfield's affidavit, the copied registry entry, and a comprehensive timeline of Nora and Richard's marriage. They sent copies to the Secretary of War, the Bureau of Pensions, and Captain Edwards' former commanding officer at Fort Bridger. Then they waited. Autumn settled over Rock Springs, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of coming winter. Owen returned to his work at the general store, while Nora began taking in sewing and laundry from townspeople who had heard her story and wanted to help. The money was modest but honest, and it allowed her to contribute to her own support rather than relying entirely on Owen's charity. Their relationship deepened during those waiting weeks, built on long conversations and shared meals and the simple pleasure of each other's company. Owen learned about Nora's childhood in Philadelphia, her love of books and music, her dreams for a future that had seemed impossible just months before. Nora learned about Owen's years as a scout, his time drifting from place to place after the war, his desire to eventually own land and build something permanent. "I have been running since I was 18, Owen confessed one evening as they walked along the creek outside town. "Never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. I told myself it was freedom, but I think it was just fear. Fear of being tied down, fear of failing if I tried to build something real." "And now?" Nora asked, her hand secure in his. "Now I think I am ready to stop running. Especially if I have a reason to stay in one place." She squeezed his fingers. "I would very much like to give you that reason, Owen Parrish." The response from the War Department arrived in mid-November, just as the first snow began to fall. Owen collected it from the post office and brought it to Nora unopened, his heart pounding with hope and dread in equal measure. They sat together in her room, the single lamp casting warm light against the gathering darkness outside. Nora's hands shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the official pages. "What does it say?" Owen asked when she remained silent, reading intently. "They are reopening my claim," Nora breathed, disbelief and joy mingling in her voice. "They state that the documentation provided by Reverend Whitfield, combined with the testimony from Fort Bridger personnel, establishes sufficient proof of legal marriage. They are formally recognizing me as the lawful widow of Captain Richard Edward and authorizing payment of all pension benefits retroactive to the date of his death." Owen felt relief crash over him like a wave. "How much? What will they pay?" Nora scanned further down the page, her eyes widening. "His captain's pension is $30 per month. Retroactive to June 1876 means they owe me approximately 5 months of back payments. That is $150 immediately, plus $30 every month going forward." She looked up at Owen, tears streaming freely. "It is more than I earned in 2 years of working for Constance Harwick. It is enough to live on, to support myself, to have a real future." He pulled her into his arms, both of them laughing and crying at once. The battle had been won. Justice had prevailed. Nora's status as Captain Edward's widow was officially recognized, and she would receive the support the government had promised in return for her husband's service and sacrifice. "You did this," Nora said against his shoulder. "You made this happen when everyone else said it was impossible." "We did this," Owen corrected. "You survived when survival seemed impossible. You kept fighting even when the world tried to break you. I just helped you find the proof they could not ignore." They celebrated that night at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, which had become something of a second home for them both. Mrs. Chen fussed over them like a proud mother, serving her best dishes and refusing payment despite their protests. "This is victory dinner," she declared firmly. "When the powerless defeat the powerful through determination and justice, we celebrate. This meal is my gift to you both." Word spread quickly through Rock Springs about Nora's successful claim. Most people were genuinely happy for her, seeing it as a triumph of persistence over bureaucratic indifference. A few, like Constance Harwick, seemed bitter that their former servant had achieved such an unexpected reversal of fortune, but their opinions held no weight against the tide of community support. With financial stability assured, Nora began to plan for her future in earnest. She could afford better housing now, could purchase proper clothing, could even consider opening a small business if she chose. But as she and Owen discussed possibilities late into the evening, it became clear that her priorities had shifted. "I do not want to stay in Rock Springs," Nora admitted one night as they sat together in her room, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest. "This town served its purpose when I had nowhere else to go, but it is not home. It could never be home." "Where would you want to go?" Owen asked, his heart lifting with hope at the implications of her words. "Somewhere with good land for ranching," Nora said thoughtfully. "Somewhere with space and clean air and the possibility of building something lasting." "You have talked about wanting a ranch someday. What if we built that together?" Owen pulled back to look at her directly. "Nora, are you saying what I think you are saying?" She met his gaze steadily, her green eyes clear and certain. "I am saying that I love you, Owen Parrish. Not the desperate love of someone who needs rescuing, but the real love of a woman who knows her own mind and heart. You have shown me that goodness still exists in this world, that not all men take advantage of vulnerability, that I can trust and risk and hope again. I do not want to face the future alone. I want to face it with you." "I love you too," Owen said, the words feeling both momentous and utterly natural. "I have loved you probably since I first saw you refusing to quit despite impossible circumstances. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret trusting me with your heart." "Then ask me," Nora whispered. Ask me properly." Owen slid from the bed to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Nora Eliza Edward, would you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife? I do not have much to offer right now beyond hard work and devotion, but I promise you a life of partnership and respect and love that will never falter." "Yes," Nora said, smiling through happy tears. "Yes, Owen, I will marry you. And we will build that ranch together, and we will create the future we both deserve." They married in December of 1876, in a small ceremony at the Rock Springs Church with Mrs. Chen, Marcus Bellamy, and a handful of friends in attendance. Nora wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and Owen wore his best clothes brushed clean of trail dust. The minister who performed the ceremony was efficient and kind, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed his bride with joy and reverence mingled together. The pension payments began arriving regularly, providing financial foundation for their plans. Owen had been saving his own wages diligently, and together they had enough capital to begin looking for land suitable for a small ranch. They spent the winter months researching properties, corresponding with land agents, and planning the practical details of their future. In March of 1877, they found what they were looking for: 200 acres of good grazing land in the foothills about 15 miles from Rock Springs, with a creek running through it and enough timber for building. The price was fair, the location was promising, and they could afford it with their combined savings. They purchased the land outright, making them property owners and giving them something neither had possessed in years, a place that truly belonged to them. Building the ranch became their shared project through the spring and summer. Owen did most of the heavy construction work, building a small but solid house, a barn, and corrals for the horses and cattle they planned to raise. Nora worked alongside him when she could, and managed the practical details of turning raw land into a working homestead. She planted a garden, established supply lines with merchants in Rock Springs, and began keeping meticulous records of their expenses and progress. They purchased their first cattle in June, 20 head of mixed stock that would form the foundation of their herd. Owen hired 2 ranch hands to help with the daily work, young men looking to learn the cattle business who were willing to work hard for fair wages and honest treatment. By autumn, the Parrish Ranch was a functioning operation. It was small compared to the massive spreads that dominated much of Wyoming, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and sustained by their own labor. Standing on their porch at sunset, looking out over land they owned and cattle bearing their brand, both Owen and Nora felt the profound satisfaction of having created something real and lasting. "You ever regret it?" Nora asked one evening as they watched the light fade behind the mountains. "Giving up your wandering life to be tied to one place?" Owen pulled her closer against his side. "Not for a single moment. This is what I was wandering toward all along. I just did not know it until I met you. I have never been happier than I am right now, building this life with you." "I feel the same," Nora admitted. "Richard would have loved this place. He talked about ranching someday, about having space and freedom and work that meant something. I think he would be glad that I found someone who could help me fulfill that dream, even if he could not be here to see it." "I hope so," Owen said quietly. "I never want you to feel like you had to forget him to love me. I have not forgotten him. I never will." Nora turned to face her husband, her eyes serious. "But I have learned that the heart has room for both grief and joy, for honoring the past while embracing the future. Richard gave me 5 years of love and taught me what a good marriage looked like. You gave me hope when I had none, and showed me I could survive loss and build again. I am grateful for both of you in different ways." Their first real test came that winter, when temperatures plummeted and snow piled higher than Owen had ever seen in his years out west. They lost 3 head of cattle to the cold despite their best efforts, and one of their ranch hands decided the work was too hard and left for easier prospects. But Owen and Nora faced the challenges together, working through exhaustion and frustration, supporting each other when spirits flagged. When spring finally arrived and they counted their surviving stock, they discovered they had actually increased their herd through calves born during the winter. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental after the hard months they had endured. In May of 1878, Nora discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with excitement tinged with nervousness, knowing that bringing a child into their still precarious ranching life would add new complications. But they embraced the change eagerly, making preparations and dreaming about the family they would raise. Their son was born in January of 1879, during another brutal Wyoming winter. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from Rock Springs who had to travel through snow to reach their remote ranch. But when Owen finally held his newborn son, seeing Nora's exhausted smile and hearing the baby's strong cry, he felt his world expand in ways he had never imagined possible. They named him Richard Owen Parrish, honoring both the husband Nora had lost and the future they were building together. Little Richard, as they called him, proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby who grew quickly under his parents' devoted care. Nora proved to be an exceptional mother, balancing the demands of infant care with her ongoing responsibilities to the ranch. Owen marveled at her strength and capability, the way she could nurse their son with one hand while reviewing account books with the other, how she sang lullabies in the same voice that called instructions to ranch hands. As their son grew from infant to toddler, the Parrish ranch continued to develop and prosper. They expanded their herd gradually, reinvesting profits into better stock and improved facilities. Owen's reputation as a fair employer and skilled rancher spread through the territory, making it easier to hire good workers when they needed additional help. In 1881, Nora gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Clara Elizabeth Parrish. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady temperament, a calm baby who rarely fussed and seemed content to observe the world around her with serious interest. With 2 young children and a growing ranch operation, life became increasingly hectic. But Owen and Nora had learned to work as a team, dividing responsibilities in ways that played to their strengths and supporting each other through challenges. They held weekly meetings to discuss ranch business, finances, and family needs, maintaining the kind of partnership that made them both feel valued and heard. The years passed in the inevitable rhythm of ranching life. Seasons of hard work followed by seasons of relative rest. Years of good profit followed by years of setback and recovery. Children growing and learning and eventually taking on ranch responsibilities of their own. Through it all, Owen and Nora remained devoted to each other, their love deepening with time rather than fading. In 1885, Nora received notification that her pension payments would continue indefinitely, as the War Department had officially classified Captain Edward among the honored dead of the Little Bighorn campaign. The money, which they had been carefully saving and reinvesting, had grown into a substantial nest egg that gave them financial security beyond the ranch's earnings. "We should do something meaningful with this," Nora suggested one evening as they reviewed their finances. "Something that honors Richard's service and helps others who might be struggling as I once was." They discussed various possibilities before settling on establishing a fund for military widows in Wyoming territory, providing temporary financial assistance to women facing similar circumstances, to what Nora had endured. They worked with lawyers in Cheyenne to set up the proper legal structure, creating an endowment that would continue helping women long after they were gone. The Widow's Hope Fund, as they named it, began operating in 1886, providing modest grants to military widows who needed help while they established their lives after loss. Nora personally reviewed every application, and Owen managed the fund's investments to ensure its long-term sustainability. It became their way of transforming personal tragedy into public good, ensuring that Richard's death and Nora's suffering resulted in assistance for others who found themselves in desperate circumstances. By 1890, the Parrish Ranch had grown into one of the most respected operations in southwestern Wyoming. They ran 400 head of cattle, employed 6 full-time ranch hands, and had expanded their land holdings to nearly 500 acres. Little Richard, now 11, was already showing talent as a horseman and cattleman. Clara, at 9, demonstrated a head for business that reminded Owen of her mother's sharp intelligence. On a warm evening in late summer of 1890, Owen and Nora sat together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains as they had done countless times before. Their children were playing in the yard, their voices carrying on the evening air. The ranch spread before them, prosperous and well-maintained, a testament to 14 years of shared labor and love. "You remember the day we met?" Nora asked, her hand finding Owen's as naturally as breathing. "When you saw my ring and understood that I was hiding secrets." "I remember thinking you were the strongest person I had ever encountered," Owen replied, squeezing her fingers gently. "Surviving impossible circumstances with dignity intact. I knew immediately that you were someone special." "I thought you were either crazy or an angel," Nora admitted with a laugh. "Nobody helps strangers the way you helped me without expecting something in return. I kept waiting for you to reveal your true intentions, to demand repayment in some unpleasant form. And instead, I just fell hopelessly in love with you. Instead, you fought the United States Army on my behalf, traveled 1,500 miles to find an elderly minister, and gave me back my life and dignity." Nora turned to look at him directly, her green eyes still as striking as the day they met. "You saved me, Owen, not just from poverty and hardship, but from believing that kindness and justice were extinct in this world." "You saved me too," Owen said seriously. "I was drifting before I met you, running from the idea of permanence because I was afraid I would fail at it. You taught me that building something real is worth the risk of losing it. You showed me what true strength looks like. And you gave me a family and a home and a purpose beyond simple survival." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children play and their ranch hands finish the day's final chores. The life they had built was not perfect, no life ever was, but it was good and honest and filled with the kind of deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work shared with someone you loved. "What do you think Richard would say if he could see us now?" Owen asked quietly, not threatened by the memory of Nora's first husband but genuinely curious. Nora considered the question carefully. "I think he would be grateful that I found happiness again. Richard was a practical man who understood that life continues after loss. He would want to know that his sacrifice was not in vain, that the pension he earned protected me when I needed it most. And I think he would approve of you, Owen. You are both good men who believed in doing the right thing even when it cost you personally. I wish I could have known him." "In a way, you do know him. You see him in our son's middle name, in the Widow's Hope Fund, in every choice I make that was shaped by the years we spent together." Nora leaned her head against Owen's shoulder. "Love does not die just because people do. It transforms and continues, becoming part of who we are and how we move through the world." Richard's love made me strong enough to survive his loss. Your love made me brave enough to hope again. Both of those things live in me, in our children, in the life we have created." The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, brilliant against the vast expanse of Wyoming night. Inside the house, lamps were being lit against the gathering darkness. Soon they would call the children in for supper, go through the evening routines of bath and bedtime stories and final ranch checks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new work, as every tomorrow did. But tonight, this moment, was perfect in its simplicity. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had fought for justice and won, who had built a life of meaning and purpose from the ashes of loss and hardship. A widow who had been stripped of everything and fought her way back to dignity. A cowboy who had recognized her worth when the world dismissed her. Together, they had created something rare and precious. A love story forged in the Wild West's harsh realities, tempered by struggle and made stronger by their refusal to accept injustice. The years continued to unfold in their natural rhythm. Richard grew into a tall, capable young man who loved the ranch with his father's passion and managed it with his mother's practical intelligence. Clara became a teacher, opening a school for ranch children in the region and eventually marrying a doctor from Cheyenne. They gave Owen and Nora 5 grandchildren who spent summers at the ranch, learning about cattle and horses and the value of honest work. The Widow's Hope Fund expanded over the decades, helping hundreds of military widows establish stable lives after loss. It became Nora's proudest legacy beyond her family, knowing that her suffering had been transformed into practical assistance for others facing similar challenges. Owen and Nora grew old together on their ranch, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, mourned the loss of friends and neighbors, welcomed grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Through it all, they remained partners in the truest sense, facing life's joys and sorrows side by side. When Owen died peacefully in 1912 at the age of 68, Nora grieved his loss deeply, but without the desperate despair that had nearly destroyed her after Richard's death. She had learned by then that love, real love, never truly ends. It continues in children and grandchildren, in the land you tended together, in the lives you touched through generosity and justice. Nora lived another 6 years, remaining active in ranch management and the Widow's Hope Fund until her final months. She died in the spring of 1918, surrounded by family, in the house Owen had built with his own hands 40 years earlier. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names, dates, and a single line chosen by their children. Together they built a life of love and justice. Next to Nora's grave, the family placed a small marker honoring Captain Richard Edward, ensuring that the husband she had fought so hard to honor would not be forgotten by future generations. The Parrish Ranch continued operating for 3 more generations, eventually becoming one of the most successful cattle operations in Wyoming. The house Owen built was expanded and modernized, but never abandoned, each generation of Parrish understanding that it represented something more than simple shelter. It stood as testament to what 2 people could build when they refused to accept injustice, when they chose love over despair, when they worked together toward shared dreams. And the Widow's Hope Fund, still operating more than a century after its founding, continued to help military widows establish stable lives after loss. A permanent legacy of one woman's suffering transformed through one man's determination into lasting good for countless others who found themselves alone and struggling in a world that too often forgot the price paid by those who served. The story of the servant girl who was actually a captain's widow, and the cowboy who made sure she got her pension back, became part of Wyoming folklore. It was told around campfires and dinner tables, embellished and romanticized over the generations, but never losing its essential truth, that love and justice, when pursued with determination and courage, can transform lives and create legacies that endure long after the original actors have departed. In the end, theirs was a simple story, really. A woman who lost everything and a man who helped her fight to reclaim it. Two souls who found each other in unlikely circumstances and chose to build a life together. A love that honored the past while embracing the future, that transformed personal tragedy into public good, that demonstrated the power of one person's willingness to stand up for what is right even when everyone else has moved on. It was a Wild West story, yes, but more than that, it was a human story. The kind of story that reminds us why love and justice matter, why fighting for others is never wasted effort, why building something meaningful requires both strength and tenderness. The kind of story that proves happy endings are possible even after tremendous loss, not because life is easy, but because people can choose to be kind and brave and persistent in the face of injustice. And in that choice, in that daily decision to honor love and pursue justice, Owen and Nora Parrish created a legacy far greater than any ranch or fund or family tree. They created hope, the kind of hope that survives hardship and loss and time itself, the kind of hope that reminds each new generation that goodness still exists in the world if we are willing to fight for it. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and the passage of time. But what they built together, what they represented to everyone who knew them or heard their tale, that lived on. In the cattle that still bore the Parrish brand, in the widows who received assistance when they needed it most, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their values forward into new generations, in the small acts of kindness and justice that rippled outward from their example, touching lives they would never know about. The servant girl who was actually a dead captain's widow had gotten her pension back, yes. But more than that, she had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her capacity to love and be loved. And the cowboy who had helped her achieve that justice had found his own redemption, his own purpose, his own happily ever after in the process. Together, they had proven that even in the harsh realities of the Wild West, even in a world that often seemed designed to crush the vulnerable and reward the powerful, love could flourish and justice could prevail. It just required people brave enough to fight for both, stubborn enough to refuse defeat, and loving enough to build something beautiful from the wreckage of loss. And that, in the end, was the truest Wild West story of all.